13th April 1940, Ofotfjord, Norway. 0630 hours. HMS Eskimo, a tribal class destroyer. Displacement 1,870 tons. Advances up the narrow fjord. Visibility is excellent. Mountains rise steeply on both sides. The fjord width at this point is approximately 800 meters. There is no room to maneuver. Ahead, German destroyers are withdrawing deeper into the fjord. Behind, British battleship HMS Warspite and 9 destroyers pursue. Eskimo is part of the leading screen. Her mission is to engage German destroyers. Clear the way for Warspite. Her 4.7-inch guns are ready. Her crew is at action stations. Speed is 28 knots. At 0632 hours, a German torpedo strikes Eskimo's bow. The explosion occurs approximately 3 meters aft of the stem. The force detonates the forward magazine. The combined explosions sever the entire bow section, everything forward of A gun turret. Approximately 15 meters of the ship separates from the hull. The bow section, still moving at 28 knots from momentum, continues forward for several seconds before sinking. The main hull, suddenly minus its entire forward section, loses speed rapidly. Water pours into the open wound where the bow had been. The forward bulkhead, never designed to be the front of the ship, faces the sea directly. Eskimo should sink. Naval architecture assumes ships have bows. Without one, the hydrodynamics are catastrophic. Water pressure at speed creates forces the internal bulkheads cannot withstand. The ship should flood forward compartments, lose buoyancy, and sink within minutes. Eskimo does not sink. The crew responds instantly. Damage control parties rush forward. They close watertight doors aft of the damaged section. They shore up the bulkhead facing the sea. They pump water from flooded compartments. The ship slows to approximately 5 knots. The water ingress stabilizes. She remains afloat, but she is crippled, dead in the water, in a narrow Norwegian fjord under enemy fire. The battle continues around her. German destroyers are still fighting. Shore batteries are firing. She cannot move forward without her bow acting as a ram to push water aside. She cannot turn in the narrow fjord. She cannot retreat at any meaningful speed. She is a stationary target. This is the beginning of HMS Eskimo's survival story. How a ship that lost 15 meters of her length, including her bow, magazine, and forward gun turret, remained afloat. How her crew jury rigged a temporary bow from wood and steel plates. How she was towed 500 kilometers across the North Sea to Scotland. How she was rebuilt and returned to combat. How she survived the war. It begins with the explosion that should have killed her, and continues through decisions made in seconds that determined whether 190 men lived or died. To understand what happened to Eskimo, you need to understand the Second Battle of Narvik and why British destroyers were fighting in a Norwegian fjord in April 1940. Germany invaded Norway on 9th April 1940. The invasion was primarily amphibious, using destroyers and transport ships to land troops at key Norwegian ports. Narvik, in northern Norway, was critical. It was the port through which Swedish iron ore, vital for German steel production, was exported to Germany. Controlling Narvik meant controlling the iron ore supply. 10 German destroyers transported 2,000 troops to Narvik on 9th April. They landed the troops, captured the port, and remained in the harbor. The destroyers were low on fuel. They had used most of it in the voyage north. They were waiting for a tanker to arrive so they could refuel and return to Germany. The Royal Navy responded immediately. On 10th April, 5 British destroyers entered Ofotfjord and attacked the German destroyers in Narvik harbor. The First Battle of Narvik resulted in 2 German destroyers sunk and several damaged, but 2 British destroyers were also sunk. The Germans retained control of Narvik. The British planned a second attack using heavier forces. Battleship Warspite, with her 15-inch guns, would provide overwhelming firepower. 9 destroyers, including Eskimo, would screen the battleship and engage German destroyers. Aircraft from Warspite would provide reconnaissance. The objective was to destroy all German naval forces in the area and support Allied troops landing to retake Narvik. The Second Battle of Narvik began 13th April at approximately 0500 hours. The British force entered Ofotfjord and began advancing toward Narvik. German destroyers, trapped by lack of fuel and the British blocking the fjord exit, prepared to fight. The geography was terrible for naval combat. Ofotfjord and its branches are narrow, steep-sided, deep water. Maneuver room is limited. Ships cannot evade torpedoes by turning. Visibility is excellent. meaning engagement ranges are short. Everything favors ambush and close-range fighting. Eskimo was at the head of the British destroyer screen. Her captain, Commander Eric St. John Fancourt, positioned her to engage German destroyers as they withdrew up the fjord. At 0630 hours, Eskimo was making 28 knots, closing on German destroyer Hermann Kühne. Kühne fired torpedoes, at least 4, possibly 5. Range was approximately 2,000 meters. At that range, torpedo runtime is less than 90 seconds. Eskimo had minimal time to evade. Fancourt ordered hard to port. The ship began turning, not fast enough. One torpedo struck the bow at 0632 hours. The warhead contained approximately 300 kilograms of hexanite explosive. The detonation occurred against the hull plating, penetrating and exploding inside. The force destroyed the forward structure completely. The explosion also detonated the forward magazine. Eskimo carried 4.7-inch ammunition in the magazine below a turret. When the torpedo explosion breached the magazine, the ammunition detonated sympathetically. This secondary explosion was larger than the torpedo itself. Combined, the two explosions vaporized everything forward of the bridge. The bow section, from the stem to approximately frame 20, separated completely. This represented approximately 15 meters of the ship's 115-meter length. The section included the bow structure, anchor gear, forward gun turret, crew spaces, and the forward magazine. Approximately 30 men were in that section. All died instantly, either from the explosions or when the section sank seconds later. The main hull, suddenly bowless, experienced immediate crisis. The forward bulkhead at frame 20 was designed to separate compartments, not to be the front of a ship. It was not reinforced for direct water pressure. The bulkhead faced the sea at 28 knots closing speed. The water pressure was enormous. Sub-Lieutenant Richard Stannard, the damage control officer, was aft of the bridge when the explosion occurred. He saw the bow disappear. He understood immediately what was happening. He ordered all watertight doors forward of frame 20 closed. He ordered maximum pumping in the forward compartments. He sent damage control parties forward with shoring materials. The ship was slowing rapidly from water resistance. Fancourt on the bridge ordered engines stopped. Continuing its speed would drive water into the ship faster than pumps could remove it. The ship had to slow, had to reduce water pressure on the damaged bulkhead. Eskimo came to near stop. Speed dropped to approximately 3 knots. The water ingress stabilized. The forward bulkhead held. The pumps managed the flooding. The ship remained afloat. But the situation was desperate. Eskimo was immobile in a combat zone. German destroyers were still fighting. Shore batteries were firing. Other British destroyers were maneuvering around her, trying to avoid collision. She was a hazard to her own forces and an easy target for the enemy. Fancourt made decisions rapidly. First, assess whether the ship could be saved. Stannard reported the bulkhead was holding but could not withstand any forward motion. The ship could not move under her own power. She needed to be towed. Second, defensive capability. The forward gun was gone. The remaining guns, two 4.7-inch in the aft positions and anti-aircraft weapons, were operational. The ship could still fight if attacked, but she could not maneuver to aim or evade. Third, crew safety. Approximately 30 dead from the explosion. The rest, approximately 160, were alive but at severe risk. If the ship sank, survival in the cold Norwegian fjord water was measured in minutes. Rescue would be difficult with the battle ongoing. Fancourt decided to save the ship. He signaled for towing assistance. Destroyer HMS Kimberley maneuvered alongside. The battle was still raging around them. German destroyers were exchanging fire with British ships. Warspite was engaging shore batteries. Kimberley had to avoid torpedoes and shell fire while positioning to take Eskimo in tow. The towing operation began at approximately 0700 hours. Kimberley passed a line to Eskimo. The line was secured. Kimberley began towing slowly. The speed was approximately 4 knots. Faster would stress the tow line and the damaged bulkhead. Slower would prolong the time in the combat zone. While Kimberley towed Eskimo out of Ofot Fjord, the battle continued. Warspite and the other destroyers engaged the remaining German destroyers. By 0800 hours, all 8 remaining German destroyers were sunk or run aground. The Germans scuttled several to prevent capture. The British achieved complete tactical victory. Narvik would fall to Allied forces within weeks. But for Eskimo, the battle was over. She was being towed slowly down Ofot Fjord. Bow missing, barely afloat. The immediate crisis was survival, not combat. The tow lasted approximately 6 hours to reach the open sea. Kimberly maintained slow, steady speed. The tow line held, Eskimo's damaged bulkhead held. Pumps ran continuously, managing the water still seeping in. The crew remained at damage control stations, ready to respond if flooding increased. By 1400 hours, Eskimo was clear of the fjords. The weather in the Norwegian Sea was moderate. Visibility was good. The immediate threat was over. But Eskimo could not be towed 500 kilometers to Scotland in her current condition. The open sea would test the damaged bulkhead beyond its capability. She needed temporary repairs. Destroyer HMS Forester came alongside in the open sea. She carried damage control specialists and materials. The specialists transferred to Eskimo. They inspected the damage. Their assessment was that the bulkhead might hold for the tow to Scotland, but the ship needed a temporary bow to reduce water pressure. The solution was improvisation. They had no proper bow structure, but they had wood, steel plates, and tools. They began constructing a temporary bow from these materials. The design was crude, a wooden framework built out from the damaged bulkhead, covered with steel plates, sealed with whatever materials could make it watertight. The construction took 18 hours. The crew worked through the night. Carpenters built the wooden framework. Welders attached steel plates. Damage control teams sealed gaps with canvas, oakum, and tar. The result was ugly but functional. A flat-fronted temporary bow that would reduce water resistance and protect the bulkhead. By 0800 hours on 14th April, the temporary bow was complete. It extended approximately 3 meters forward of the bulkhead. It was not streamlined. It would create enormous drag, but it would allow the ship to be towed at slightly higher speed without the water pressure destroying the bulkhead. The tow to Scotland began. Kimberly resumed towing duty. Speed increased to approximately 6 knots. The temporary bow held. Water still leaked through, but the pumps managed it. The voyage would take approximately 4 days, weather permitting. The weather did not permit. On 15th April, the North Sea conditions deteriorated. Wind increased to approximately 40 knots. Sea state increased. Waves of 3 to 4 meters struck Eskimo's temporary bow. The wooden structure flexed. The steel plates worked loose. Water poured through gaps. The crew responded continuously. They resealed gaps. They shored up the wooden structure. They pumped constantly. The temporary bow was failing. If it collapsed completely, the water pressure on the bulkhead would likely cause catastrophic flooding. Fancourt considered abandoning ship. The crew could transfer to Kimberly or other escorts. Eskimo could be scuttled. This would save the men but lose the ship. He consulted with Stannard and the damage control teams. Could they keep her afloat? Stannard believed yes. If the weather did not worsen further, they continued. The temporary bow held together, barely. The structure was degrading constantly but had not yet failed completely. The crew worked in shifts, repairing damage as it occurred. No one slept properly. Everyone was exhausted, but the ship remained afloat. On 17th April, Eskimo reached the Orkney Islands. Tugs met her and took over towing from Kimberly. The final approach to Scapa Flow was slow and careful. Eskimo was guided to a berth. At 1600 hours on 17th April, she moored at Scapa Flow. The voyage was complete. The ship that had lost her bow on 13th April had survived 4 days of towing across the North Sea. The temporary wooden bow had held long enough. The crew had maintained her afloat through continuous effort. She had made it home. The damage assessment at Scapa Flow was comprehensive. The entire forward section from the stem to frame 20 was gone. The forward magazine was destroyed. A gun turret was lost. Structural damage extended aft to frame 30. The ship required essentially complete reconstruction of her forward third. The repair work was assigned to Chatham Dockyard. Eskimo was towed to Chatham in May 1940. The repairs would take 11 months. The entire bow section had to be rebuilt. New frames, new plating, new turret, new magazine, new crew spaces. The work was equivalent to building a new destroyer forward of the bridge. During the repair period, the Royal Navy analyzed what had happened. How had Eskimo survived an explosion that destroyed 15 meters of her hull? The analysis identified several factors. First, the torpedo struck at the extreme forward position. If it had struck 5 meters further aft, it would have hit more central structures. The ship might not have survived. The extreme forward hit meant the explosion vented mostly forward and upward, not into the core of the ship. Second, the watertight bulkhead at frame 20 held. This bulkhead was robust because it separated the forward magazine from the rest of the ship. It was designed to contain magazine explosions. While not designed to be the front of the ship, it had sufficient strength to hold against water pressure at low speeds. Third, the crew response was immediate and effective. Closing watertight doors, pumping, shoring up the bulkhead, all happened within minutes. If the response had been slower, the flooding would have overwhelmed the pumps. The ship would have sunk before she could be taken in tow. Fourth, the decision to stop engines prevented water pressure from collapsing the bulkhead. If Fancourt had tried to maintain speed, the pressure would have breached the bulkhead within minutes. Stopping meant accepting immobility but ensured survival. Fifth, luck. The weather during the tow was bad but not catastrophic. If it had been worse, the temporary bow would have failed. If German aircraft had found them during the tow, Eskimo could not have defended effectively. If the tow line had parted in open sea, recovery would have been difficult. Multiple variables could have doomed the ship. None did. Eskimo emerged from repairs in March 1941. She was essentially a new ship forward of the bridge. The repairs included improvements to her original design, better damage control systems, improved watertight integrity, enhanced pumping capacity. The lessons from her survival were incorporated into her reconstruction. She returned to active service in April 1941. She was assigned to the home fleet, then to convoy escort duties, then to the Mediterranean. She participated in multiple operations: Malta convoys, Operation Pedestal, North African landings. She was damaged several times but never as severely as at Narvik. She survived the war. In 1945, she was still operational. She was decommissioned in 1949 and scrapped in 1950. She had served 9 years, including 8 years of war service. The ship that should have sunk in a Norwegian fjord lasted the entire war. The crew who saved her at Narvik received recognition. Sub-Lieutenant Stannard received the Victoria Cross, though for separate actions commanding a armed trawler later. He had been transferred from Eskimo before that action, but his damage control work on Eskimo was noted in his records. Commander Fancourt received commendation for saving his ship. Multiple crew members received medals for damage control and repair work. But the real story is not the medals. The real story is the decisions made in seconds after the torpedo hit. Close the watertight doors, stop the engines, shore up the bulkhead, pump continuously. These decisions, made by trained men under enormous stress, saved 160 lives and a valuable warship. The improvised wooden bow is another story. No one had trained for building a temporary bow from lumber and steel plates in the open sea. The crew invented the solution on site using available materials. They built it in 18 hours while the ship drifted in Norwegian waters. They maintained it through 4 days of rough sea. It held long enough. This improvisation characterized British damage control throughout the war. When standard procedures failed, invent new ones. When proper materials were unavailable, use what you have. When the ship is supposed to sink, refuse to let it. The attitude saved multiple ships that should have been lost. Eskimo's survival became a case study in damage control training. The specific circumstances, losing the bow to a torpedo in a narrow fjord, were unlikely to repeat. But the principles were universal. Immediate response, watertight integrity, pumping capacity, improvisation when necessary. These lessons were taught to every damage control team in the Royal Navy. The temporary wooden bow became legendary. Photographs showed Eskimo with a flat-fronted structure replacing her bow, looking absurd but functional. The image was used in training materials, in propaganda, in histories. It demonstrated British resilience, ingenuity, and refusal to accept defeat. But the wooden bow was just a tool. The real achievement was the crew keeping the ship afloat long enough for the bow to matter. The pumps running continuously for 4 days. The damage control party sealing leaks as they appeared. The engineering crew maintaining power for pumps and essential systems. The entire ship's company working together to save their vessel. No one person saved Eskimo. Fancourt made good command decisions. Stannard directed effective damage control. The specialists built the temporary bow, but the ship was saved by collective effort. Every crew member contributed. The cook kept the crew fed. The signalman maintained communications. The lookouts watched for threats. Everyone did their job under extreme stress. This collective competence is what naval training aims to produce. A crew that functions as a unit, where every person knows their role and executes it under any conditions. Eskimo's crew demonstrated this at Narvik, when their ship lost its bow. They did not panic. They responded according to training and then improvised beyond training when necessary. The ship herself contributed to survival. Tribal-class destroyers were well designed. Good compartmentalization, robust watertight bulkheads, effective pumping systems. The design features that allowed Eskimo to survive were built into her at construction. The crew exploited these features but did not create them. Naval architecture and crew competence combined to produce survival. Neither alone would have been sufficient. Good design with poor crew would fail. Good crew with poor design would fail. Together, they succeeded. After the war, when naval architects studied Eskimo's survival, they identified design improvements: stronger forward bulkheads, better damage control access, more pumping capacity, enhanced watertight integrity. These improvements were incorporated into post-war destroyer designs. Eskimo's experience informed an entire generation of warship construction, but the fundamental lesson remained unchanged. Ships survive when crews refuse to let them sink. All the design features, all the damage control equipment, all the training. These provide tools. The crew provides the will. Eskimo's crew willed their ship to survive. After the explosion, after the bow sank, after water poured into the hull, they could have abandoned ship. No one would have blamed them. The ship was supposed to sink. Protocol suggested evacuation. They stayed. They closed doors. They pumped. They shored up bulkheads. They built a temporary bow from wood and hope. They towed her 500 kilometers through rough seas. They kept her afloat when every factor suggested she should sink. This is the story of HMS Eskimo, not just the ship that lost her bow and survived, but the crew that refused to let her die. The damage control parties working in flooded compartments, the carpenters building a bow from lumber, the pumps running continuously for days, the collective determination that transformed certain loss into improbable survival. The wooden bow is the symbol. The photograph of Eskimo with her flat-fronted temporary structure is the image everyone remembers. But the symbol represents human effort, the improvisation, the endurance, the refusal to quit. When Eskimo was scrapped in 1950, pieces of her were saved. Her bell, her nameplate, some structural elements. These artifacts are in museums. They tell the story of the ship that survived decapitation. But the complete story includes the men. Fancourt making the decision to stop engines. Stannard directing damage control. The specialist building the temporary bow. The crew pumping and repairing for 4 straight days. Every man who contributed to keeping Eskimo afloat. They are mostly forgotten now. Their names are in records. Some received medals. Most did not. They were doing their jobs. The Navy expected competence under stress. They provided it. This was normal. Not exceptional. But normal competence under extreme stress is exceptional. Performing trained procedures when your ship is sinking is heroic, even if you do not think of it that way. Staying calm when you should panic is courage, even if you consider it duty. Eskimo's crew were heroes. They would have rejected the term. They were sailors doing their jobs. The ship needed to be saved. They saved it. Nothing extraordinary. History judges differently. Extraordinary circumstances reveal who responds and who fails. Eskimo lost her bow in a Norwegian fjord. She should have sunk. She did not because her crew refused to let her. That refusal, sustained over 4 days and 500 kilometers, is what makes the story matter. Not the wooden bow. Not the technical details of damage control. But the human decision to keep fighting when surrender would be easier and more rational. Eskimo survived decapitation. The crew survived too. Most lived through the war. Some died later. None forgot 13th April 1940. The day their ship lost her bow and they discovered they could save her anyway. The ship was rebuilt and fought again. The crew served on other ships, trained other sailors, carried the experience forward. The lessons they learned at Narvik saved other ships, other crews. Their survival was not just their own. It was a template for everyone who came after. This is why Eskimo matters, not as an oddity, a ship without a bow, but as proof that determination and competence can overcome circumstances that should be fatal. The ship survived because her crew made her survive. No other reason. No miracle. Just human refusal to accept defeat. The wooden bow is in a museum now. A piece of absurd improvisation that worked long enough. Look at it, and remember it represents men working through a freezing night to build something that should not have worked, but did. Remember it represents pumps running for 4 days straight. Damage control parties sealing leaks. A captain making the right decisions in seconds. A crew that would not quit. Remember HMS Eskimo, the ship that survived decapitation, and the men who refused to let her die